In the summer of 2022, the small township of Elmsbrook was preparing for a development boom. A quiet place with more grain silos than traffic lights, Elmsbrook wasn't used to much change. That made what happened all the more disturbing. A real estate company, Northridge Development, purchased 90 acres on the town's outer ridge, a flat, wooded area with no buildings and little history, or so they were told. Routine aerial drone scans were conducted before breaking ground, but what returned left the crew puzzled. Beneath the soil, about 18 feet down, the thermal scans showed unnatural patterns. Straight corridors, angular rooms, large open spaces, too symmetrical for caves, too planned for nature. At first, they assumed it was an old military bunker. Elmsbrook sat only 40 miles from a decommissioned Air Force base. The developers contacted the county clerk's office to retrieve old maps, land deeds, and building permits. Nothing turned up. Not a single document hinted that anything had ever existed on that land. The county records were clean, too clean, and yet the surveyors were certain something was there, and it had been there for decades. Curiosity gave way to concern. If it was military, there could be hazardous material. An environmental team was called in. They conducted a shallow dig, just enough to probe beneath the thick overgrowth. That's when they found the concrete slab, overgrown with roots and moss, nearly fused into the earth like a gravestone. There were no windows, no markings, just a corroded steel door half buried. By then, whispers had already started circulating among townspeople. The older residents, those in their 70s and 80s, seemed uneasy. When asked, they dismissed it. Probably just an old barn foundation, one said, though his eyes didn't match the ease in his voice. Then came the story of Ruth Anderson, age 92, one of the town's oldest living residents. Her granddaughter posted on Facebook that Ruth remembered something about a clinic being built during the war, but nobody was allowed near it. Nurses came in at night, ambulances with their headlights off. She said people were taken there to get better, but nobody ever came back. Most folks thought she was just old and confused. That theory collapsed the moment the steel door was breached. A thick rush of air hissed out from the cracks like a long, held breath. What lay beneath was not a barn or a bunker or even a clinic. It was a hospital, 4 levels deep, with tiled corridors, patient rooms, operating theaters, and records that had yellowed and curled with age. Beds were still strapped down. Cabinets labeled with patient codes were sealed shut. But the most unsettling detail, the power was still partially functional. The lowest levels, level 3 and level 4, were cold, with vents still pushing faint, chilled air through rusted grates. A backup generator, hidden in a reinforced room behind the old surgical ward, was humming just enough to keep those chambers preserved. And then came the sealed doors, 3 inches thick, electronically locked, and oddly advanced for their time. When specialists finally cracked them open, the discovery inside made national headlines. 185 corpses, each individually wrapped, numbered, and placed on gurneys in tidy rows. Some appeared mummified from the cold. Others seemed eerily recent. When the press arrived, government officials denied knowing anything. The land had never been registered, the structure never permitted. The facility was not on any map, civilian or military. It was as if the place had never existed at all, a building built to be forgotten. But the question haunted everyone involved: if it was never meant to be found, who kept the power on all these years? Within days, conspiracy theorists, journalists, and historians descended on Elmsbrook. Some believed it was a Cold War experiment facility. Others called it a rogue asylum. A few whispered that it was a place where people were sent to disappear, patients who didn't matter, stripped of identity, buried under silence and stone. But one thing became clear: this was no ordinary hospital. It was deliberate, designed to vanish, and the fact that it was still humming beneath the ground meant one of two things: either someone never truly left, or someone never wanted it to be over. This was just the beginning. When the thick steel doors of level 4 groaned open, even the seasoned investigators held their breath. The stale, frigid air that spilled out carried the weight of decades, of secrets, silence, and something unspoken. What lay beyond that final barrier stunned even the most experienced forensic teams. The room wasn't chaotic, it wasn't derelict, it was orderly, too orderly. The bodies, 185 of them, lay on individual gurneys arranged in perfect geometric precision. Not a single cart was out of alignment. Each one faced the same direction. Each head was positioned at precisely the same angle. The rows spanned from one concrete wall to the next, ending in a seamless curve as if someone had taken time and care to create symmetry out of death. These weren't mass grave victims or battlefield casualties. No, these were patients, documented, labeled, and intentionally preserved. Each body was shrouded in a heavy wax-coated linen sheet, yellowed with age but remarkably intact. Attached to each was a steel tag, riveted directly into the gurney, etched with a number and a 4-letter code. That code became the first clue. Forensic analysts cross-referenced the patterns, assuming they were patient IDs. But no national or military database recognized them. More alarming still was the condition of the corpses. Despite the time past estimated at over 50 years, many of the bodies showed signs of artificial preservation. Not formaldehyde, not even modern embalming techniques, but something else, a chemical unknown to modern pathology. Some of the bodies were in an almost lifelike states, skin waxy, eyes intact, hair undisturbed. One forensic pathologist said, they didn't just die and rot, they were kept. Among the dead were men, women, and even children, ranging from approximately age 5 to age 60. Their racial and ethnic backgrounds varied. Some had signs of old surgeries, others had scars consistent with restraint. A few had chest cavities opened and stitched with no apparent organ removal. Just an incision and closure, none of it made sense. And yet, the room told a story. On the far wall was a mural, partially faded by condensation and time. It had once been brightly painted, an ocean scene, oddly calming, with blue skies and smiling children in paper boats. A grotesque contrast to the reality in front of it. Beneath the mural, a stainless steel tray cart held 7 worn leather journals, all sealed in plastic wrap. They belonged to a man named Dr. Walter Greaves, whose name had not appeared on any license, registry, or historical record. Inside the journals were handwritten logs, each dated and signed. They chronicled what he called the second phase of compliance testing. Phrases like "subject held well under stimulus C" and "recalibrated memory wipe complete, no post-shock recovery" were repeated often. The tone was clinical, detached, void of empathy, but in the last journal something changed. Dr. Greaves wrote, "I was wrong. They weren't meant for this. They remember too much. It's not silence I hear at night. It's guilt. If you find this, forgive me. We were told it was for national security, but what we created was something darker." Investigators began to suspect that the facility wasn't a hospital at all, at least not in the traditional sense. It may have operated under the guise of psychiatric treatment, but it behaved more like a controlled experiment center. The idea that hundreds of people were kept alive, experimented on, and then preserved like specimens led to national outcry. Public pressure forced the government to open a formal inquiry. Still, documents were redacted, officials denied knowledge, and many involved in the investigation reported strange surveillance after returning home. The town of Elmsbrook tried to grieve. Candlelight vigils were held. DNA samples were sent to genealogical databases in hopes of identifying victims. Some were matched to families in other states, families who had reported loved ones missing in the 1970s and were told they walked away or vanished without a trace. But what haunted the public most wasn't the death, it was the intention. Someone, some group, had invested time, money, and effort to create a facility that erased people cleanly and quietly. These victims weren't accidents. They were deliberately taken, numbered, silenced, and hidden, all beneath a hospital that never appeared on a single map. And now, exposed under the blinding lights of forensic teams and news cameras, they were no longer forgotten. Each body in those perfect rows stood as a symbol of every truth buried too deep, every voice that was silenced, and every lie told in the name of order. When word of the 185 bodies beneath the unregistered hospital surfaced, the town of Elmsbrook was paralyzed, not just with grief, but with déjà vu. For years, there had been rumors, strange disappearances. Disoriented people wandering near the woods, stories told in hushed tones at family dinners, or warned by old women who lived too long to forget. Most residents brushed them off as urban legends. After all, Elmsbrook was a small town with little to offer but quiet nights and worn-down storefronts. No one believed that the government, or anyone powerful, cared enough to do something monstrous here. But the Elmsbrook experiments, as they would come to be called, were not legend, they were real. In the weeks following the discovery, declassified documents slowly made their way into the public eye, mostly due to leaked photos, whistleblowers, and relentless independent journalists. Files stamped top secret, once buried in government vaults, revealed a troubling pattern of off-the-record operations in rural America during the Cold War era. Elmsbrook had been chosen decades ago for one reason: isolation. Nestled between thick forests and far from any metropolitan attention, it was the perfect place to disappear people and hide the evidence. The experiments began in 1961 under the codename Project Ecolaf, a psychological research initiative supposedly designed to explore trauma responses in controlled environments. But the files hinted at something much darker. Test subjects were not volunteers. Many were institutionalized individuals, misdiagnosed or even falsely diagnosed with schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, or dissociative identity disorder. Others were rumored to be political dissidents, troublesome, whistleblowers, or even undocumented immigrants with no traceable background. Some were children, a fact that broke the nation's heart. The goal of the experiments was said to be personality reengineering. In other words, they weren't trying to cure people. They were trying to erase them and rebuild something new. Procedures included electroshock therapy administered without anesthesia, extended sensory deprivation, in some cases for weeks at a time, forced isolation, neurological stimulation, combined with subliminal messaging, chemical sedation. For memory alteration, subjects were kept underground, on the hidden. Level 4, out of sight from even the hospital's daytime staff. Only a select group of handlers were allowed access, many of whom used pseudonyms or were military contractors operating off the books. A few of these handlers came forward anonymously after the story broke. One former nurse, known only as Miriam, described seeing a boy no older than 9 strapped to a gurney for nearly 72 hours. He didn't scream. She said in a trembling interview, "That's what haunted me. He just stared at me like he knew I wouldn't help him." Another whistleblower shared notes smuggled from a handler's notebook, showing chilling entries like, "Subject 44B retained baseline empathy, restart procedure. Subject 12 showed compliance under auditory isolation. Recommend group exposure for recalibration." Keep Elmsbrook running quietly, no headlines, no leaks. The community's elders remembered patients who never left and ambulances that came at night without sirens. One gravedigger even claimed he was once hired to dig deep pits in the woods nearby, but the ground was never filled. They said it was septic testing. I don't think that's what it was. In hindsight, Elmsbrook's children were taught not to ask questions, not to wander near the facility's southern fence, not to go into the woods at night, and certainly not to speak to the white vans that came and went without license plates. Even local clergy, it was later discovered, had raised concerns. Father Gregory Penn wrote a letter in 1974 to the state governor describing unholy screams carried by the wind, and the stench of despair leaking from that place. The letter was never answered. It wasn't even filed. Perhaps the most disturbing evidence came from a tape recording discovered in the corner of a basement filing cabinet at Elmsbrook's abandoned town hall. Labeled E1976/Subject A42 Memory Retention Test, the grainy audio featured a voice, male, older, coldly scientific, asking a series of questions. Each time, a young voice replied, sounding fatigued, robotic, and terrified. It ended with a single phrase repeated 3 times by the child: "I don't know who I was, I don't know who I was, I don't know who I was." That phrase became a rallying cry for the victims' families and the town of Elmsbrook. A mural was painted near the town square, 185 blank silhouettes, each with the words "I don't know who I was" painted in white over the chest. A memorial, yes, but also a warning. The Elmsbrook experiments remind us, when accountability fades, evil doesn't scream, it whispers. And the scariest part, some still believe the experiments didn't end. They just moved somewhere else, to another quiet town, on another hidden map. In every story of darkness, there is someone who refuses to close their eyes. At Elmsbrook, that someone was Nurse Evelyn Maris. She wasn't from Elmsbrook originally. Born in Ohio in 1942, Evelyn moved to the small wooded town in 1975 after her husband passed away in a car accident. She wanted a fresh start. The hospital, a quiet, unassuming facility tucked behind rusted gates and masked by ivy, covered walls, offered her a job almost immediately. No interview, no background check. Just a signature and a warning: "We value loyalty above all else." At first, Evelyn didn't question it. The early days were mundane. She distributed medication, helped elderly patients walk the halls, and changed linens on beds that were rarely slept in. The place felt strange, but she chalked it up to grief and displacement. That is, until she was assigned to Ward C. Ward C wasn't on the main blueprint. It sat behind a thick metal door in the sub-basement, an area she had never been told about during orientation. The elevator to reach it required a key, and the halls were dimly lit with motion. Sensor lights that flickered on like they were surprised someone was still alive. Evelyn was told she'd be assisting in advanced behavioral studies, and warned not to interact emotionally with the patients. "They're not like us," one superior said. "You'll understand in time." But Evelyn was a nurse first and human always. The first patient she met was Lena, a 14-year-old girl who sat on her cot staring at her hands. Her chart said nonverbal extreme defiance disorder, but Evelyn saw none of that. She was just quiet, empty, like something had been taken from her, not broken within her. On the second day, Lena whispered, "Do you know where my mom is?" That broke something in Evelyn. She began to take notes. Nothing obvious, just coded observations in a personal notebook she kept beneath her uniform. Over weeks, she noticed strange routines: injections at midnight, loud mechanical sounds behind the east wall, children being wheeled out and returned hours later in a catatonic state. None of the staff used their real names. Everyone wore white, and the doctors rarely spoke, but when they did, their words were terrifying. Evelyn once overheard a conversation between 2 of them. Subject 87 retained long-term memory. Restart with serum. What about the ethics board? There is no board. She realized then that she wasn't in a hospital. She was in a laboratory. The final straw came when she was asked to assist in observation therapy. A euphemism for forced isolation. She watched through a one-way mirror as a young boy, no older than 10, screamed for help while lights pulsed and mechanical hums echoed around him. The doctor next to her simply jotted something down and muttered, "Good retention spike. Proceed to phase Roman 2. Evelyn walked out that night and never returned, but she didn't disappear. She went to Elmsbrook's town clerk only to find that the hospital wasn't listed in any town records. She visited the local paper. They refused to run her story, saying it was above their clearance. She contacted a federal health board, but her letter was returned unopened, marked unknown facility address. Then they came after her. 3 days later, her mailbox was ripped out. Her tires were slashed. A man in a gray coat appeared outside her window one evening and stayed there until dawn, never blinking. But Evelyn didn't stop. She sent copies of her notes to multiple out-of-state newspapers and reached out to whistleblower networks. Eventually, a small independent journalist based in Minnesota picked up her story. He published it under the headline, "The Nurse Who Saw Too Much." The article went viral. Pressure mounted. Protesters began gathering near the hospital gates. And when the government could no longer deny what was unfolding in Elmsbrook, the facility was raided. The public was told it was an internal audit, but insiders knew it was a cover-up unraveling at the seams. Evelyn testified anonymously in front of a Senate committee, her voice disguised, her face hidden, but her words were crystal clear. "I watched children lose their names. I watched people become experiments. I don't care what clearance you have. This was evil." She passed away in 2016 at the age of 74. But before she died, she wrote a book under a pseudonym titled Beneath the Gown. It chronicled everything she saw. Though it never made the bestseller list, it became a sacred document for activists fighting for medical transparency. Today, outside the now demolished remains of Elmsbrook Hospital, there's a statue, not of a child, not of a victim, but of a woman in a nurse's cap holding a notebook. The plaque reads, "In memory of Evelyn Maris, who spoke when silence was easier." For decades, the 185 bodies beneath the hidden hospital in Elmsbrook were just that, bodies. Silent, still, nameless. But in time, they became something far greater. Symbols of truth, reminders of a dark chapter, and ultimately, sparks of change. It began with a single tooth. During the investigation that followed the hospital's unsealing, forensic teams worked day and night, trying to catalog the remains. Many were children, some were elderly. Others seemed altered, their bone structures or internal organs unlike standard anatomy. One skeleton, smaller than the rest, had a tooth with a tiny silver heart engraved on it, a custom detail, not part of any government procedure. It belonged to Amelia Clark, a 9-year-old girl who disappeared in 1983 from her backyard in Pennsylvania. Her case had gone cold years ago, her family told to move on, but that tiny heart proved otherwise. She hadn't wandered off, she'd been taken and buried beneath a hospital no one knew existed. With Amelia's identity confirmed, pressure mounted to give names to the others. A task force was formed, Project Echo, to run DNA tests, scan missing person archives, and reach out to long-forgotten families. It was exhausting, often inconclusive work, but it mattered. Each name was a victory. A life reclaimed. By 2012, 89 individuals were identified. Every single one had a missing person report. Not one of them had ever been connected to Elmsbrook before. The truth started to reshape national dialogue. Congressional hearings were televised, families testified, some broke down. Others just stared into the camera and whispered names that had once echoed through playgrounds, living rooms, and birthday parties. But identifying the bodies was just the beginning. The real change came when their stories were told. A teacher named Lydia Monroe, who lost her brother to Elmsbrook in 1979, began visiting high schools across the country. She didn't talk about politics or conspiracy. She talked about value. She told students, "Every time you feel small or unheard, remember this. There were kids just like you who had their voices taken. You are their voice now. Don't waste it." Lydia's talks caught fire. She was invited to TEDx, school boards, youth leadership conferences. Her message was always the same: value human life, demand transparency, protect the forgotten. Universities began including Elmsbrook in ethics classes. Not as a footnote, but as a full case study in institutional neglect, abuse of power, and the consequence of silence. Medical boards revised whistleblower policies. More stringent oversight procedures were adopted, especially for private medical and research facilities. An entire generation of students became advocates, not just professionals, and then came the memorial. It wasn't built by the government, it was built by the families. On the same land where the hospital once stood, a quiet park was created. Winding paths carved through rows of white stones, 185 of them, each with a name or simply the word known to God. At the center stood a large black monument engraved with these words: "They were taken in silence, they will be remembered in truth." Every year on March 17, the date the bodies were discovered, a gathering takes place, candles are lit, stories are read aloud. Survivors and descendants stand side by side, not in mourning, but in defiance of erasure. They remember not how these people died, but that they lived, they mattered. What changed because of them? Hospital accountability increased nationwide. Missing persons investigations became federally coordinated. Families found closure after decades of darkness. A generation learned that silence is never protection. But perhaps most importantly, their story became a beacon. Not just a warning of what humans are capable of doing in secret, but of what can happen when truth comes to light, even decades later. Because sometimes the world forgets names, it forgets faces, it forgets screams no one heard, but when the silence breaks, when one nurse speaks, when one journalist listens, when one family refuses to give up, the world remembers. The 185 who were buried beneath Elmsbrook didn't choose to be heroes. They were victims of something monstrous, but because they were found, because people cared, they became legends of change. They changed laws. They changed hearts, they changed history, and in that change, they were no longer forgotten. They were finally seen. There are stories we tell to comfort. There are stories we tell to inspire. And then there are stories like this, so haunting, so buried in silence that telling them becomes not a choice but a responsibility. The discovery of 185 bodies beneath a forgotten hospital wasn't just another mystery, it was a reckoning. It wasn't only about how those people died. It was about how they disappeared from memory, from records, from the map itself. It was about how silence, when institutionalized, becomes a kind of violence. A violence that seeps through generations, hidden in files, erased from official histories. So why must this story be told? Because the truth heals, but only when it's spoken. For decades, families were told their loved ones had simply vanished. That maybe they ran away, that maybe they would turn up. Some were even blamed, accused of hysteria or bad parenting. Those families lived in limbo, not with answers, but with a question mark that never went away. When those 185 bodies were found, the truth didn't just reopen wounds, it validated them. It proved that the pain was real, that the doubt was misplaced, that justice had taken too long, but it wasn't impossible. And in that moment, the act of telling the story became sacred. Not for entertainment, not for headlines, but for healing. Because silence is a breeding ground for repetition. We've seen it again and again. When institutions bury secrets, they grow. Unchecked power is a pattern that echoes through history, from medical experiments in Tuskegee to orphanage abuse scandals in Europe to the atrocities of secret military sites. Each time the world remained silent, the cost was human life. Elmsbrook was no different, a hospital with no official record, staff paid in cash, patients admitted with no paper trail, experiments done under the guise of treatment, and a basement filled with the evidence, 185 souls laid out in deliberate, clinical rows. Some altered, some children, none acknowledged. If we don't tell that story, we allow it to happen again, not in the same way, but in a new form, one suited to modern shadows, different methods, same indifference. This story is a warning, but it's also a blueprint for what courage looks like. The nurse who refused to stay silent risked everything. She didn't just speak, she exposed. She named names, traced documents, endured threats. And for what? Not for fame, not for revenge, but because she knew that telling the truth might cost her, but hiding it cost others everything. Journalists who ignored protocols to chase the buried story. Forensic teams who worked in sub-zero temperatures to identify bones. Lawmakers who faced backlash for investigating a ghost hospital. These are the people who didn't look away, and in doing so, they lit a path for the rest of us. And what of the forgotten, the nameless? They remind us that every life has value, even when society says otherwise. In a world obsessed with celebrity and visibility, these 185 remind us of the quiet, powerful truth. Your name does not need to be famous to matter. Your face doesn't need to be known to deserve justice. Every heartbeat, every breath, every human deserves to be remembered, not for how they died, but for the fact that they lived. That's why this story must be told, because in a time when misinformation spreads faster than truth, real stories matter more than ever, because it's too easy to turn the page on things that make us uncomfortable. Because the moment we forget the past, we risk repeating it, with new victims and new silences. This story isn't just about the hospital. It's about the cost of ignoring the uncomfortable. It's about what we lose when we value secrecy over accountability. And it's about the power of a single voice in a sea of silence. So tell it. Tell it in classrooms, tell it in books, tell it in films, tell it in whispered prayers or loud protests. But whatever you do, don't stop telling it. Because somewhere, someone is in the dark, wondering if anyone will speak up. Let this story be the answer. Let this story be the light. Let it say, you are not forgotten, and you never will be.